28th of August, 22nd Sunday in Ordinary Time. Sermon on Hebrews chapter 13, verses 1 to 8 and 15 to 16. And Luke chapter 14, verses 7 to 14. Sometimes we have teaching from the Scriptures that stretches our minds and challenges our ability to understand. Today, however, our Bible passages sound almost prosaic in how they instruct us. There's nothing trivial, though, in what they say, and it would be good to pay close attention to this guidance. Keep on loving each other. That's the opening words from Hebrews chapter 13, the closing passage of this long letter. We Christians know that we must love one another, bearing with each other even when we have differences of opinion. But then comes the challenge. Do not forget to entertain strangers. I imagine many of us do, or have in the past, forgotten just that. We prefer to spend time with the people we know, people who think and behave like us. We might even suspect strangers of presenting a risk. However, the writer of this letter says that by entertaining strangers, some have entertained angels without knowing it. Well, if I have certainly not been aware of it. But I have sometimes had close interaction with strangers, people not exactly like me. Entertain is not quite the word I would use. It sounds like lavish hospitality, feasting perhaps putting on a song and dance act. That's not what I've done. But I've often taken our local big issue seller out for lunch. She's become my friend. I've sat on the pavement sharing sandwiches with homeless individuals. We briefly housed a Syrian refugee, and I once helped my painter and decorator to choose hymns for his wedding. I doubt if any of them is an angel, but these are interactions that could bear future fruit. Jesus' words to a group of Pharisees in Luke 14 go further. Jesus had been invited to the Pharisees' house, and, we're told, he was being carefully watched. So this invitation had a hidden agenda. They were trying to catch him out. Jesus took the opportunity to challenge the Pharisees about acts of mercy on the Sabbath day, and he healed a man with dropsy before their eyes. He then noticed how the other guests jostled for places of honour at the table, and he gave them a lesson in humility, telling them always to take the most humble position, because those who do so will ultimately be exalted. This advice flies in the face of the way most of us tend to behave and what society encourages. We like to be honoured, noticed, favoured. We admire those who make themselves prominent in some way, even by trivial details, such as what they're wearing. Rich and famous people sometimes make a display of charitable work, perhaps spending a night sleeping rough alongside homeless people, or working for a day at a food bank. But they do little to tackle the source of the problems of homelessness and poverty. Then Jesus addressed the issue that we read about in our passage from Hebrews, entertaining or hospitality. Like the writer of Hebrews, Jesus encouraged the Pharisees, and no doubt his followers, to offer hospitality to strangers, the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind. Disabled people would not be considered strangers today, but in Jesus' time the Jews tended to shun those who had something that made them different or imperfect. Such individuals were not allowed into the temple. They were often excluded in other ways, and might even be considered unclean. And so these words of Jesus were groundbreaking. Hold a banquet and invite the outcasts of society. That's something we can do. Some churches have a notice outside their doors saying something like, "You're welcome if you're filthy rich or dirt poor, if you're just out of prison, if you're straight or gay, drunk or sober." My old Anglican church in Halifax was one such community. They made everyone welcome. One morning, a young man came in, having spent the night getting rather intoxicated. But as he passed our church, he remembered he'd gone to Sunday school there as a child, and he came in. He was made to feel really welcome. On another occasion, a woman came into our communion service and asked for a cup of tea. Someone went and made it for her, and, because we were having a church lunch, invited her to stay, so she heard the rest of the service too. Angels? Probably not, but who's to say? In all this talk of entertaining strangers, though, let's not forget those first words of our passage from Hebrews, to keep on loving each other as brothers and sisters. It's something we assume we all do, but it's easy to slip into unloving ways. The church is made up of all sorts of people, some of whom might well have been considered strangers at one time. Some churches are noted for developing cliques, groups of people who get into a holy huddle after the service to the exclusion of the rest. Some of us are quick to judge others, even viewing them as not real Christians. To be part of a congregation in which everyone is truly loved and welcome is a wonderful experience. Fortunately, as many of us develop the pattern of staying for fellowship after the service, with or without coffee, we come to know each other better, share one another's hopes and fears, help with problems, give advice. It all helps to build and sustain the sort of love that the writer of Hebrews intends. Family love, seeing each other as our brothers and sisters. Having read this passage, I know I have work to do on this. The writer of Hebrews has more advice for his church. Remember, these Christians were facing persecution. It was vital that they remained strong and united. And so the injunction to avoid sexual immorality is essential. Churches have been decimated if immorality takes hold. Similarly, to avoid the love of money, but to be content with what we have, is good counsel that enables us to build trust in God rather than riches. And finally, the writer returns to the subject of sacrifice, which he'd addressed earlier in his letter. Not animals, though, sacrificed on the altar, but the sacrifices of praise offered to God, and acts of service and generosity to others. Many theologians believe that this letter was addressed to Jewish Christians living in Rome, just prior to the intense persecution inflicted by Nero. If that is the case, then we know that many of the readers of this letter witnessed to their faith in the arenas, facing wild beasts, or were burnt as torches to illuminate Nero's gardens. How necessary then was this prosaic-sounding advice, helping to build up this congregation and to strengthen them for whatever was to come. We don't face intense persecution, but there are challenges that we too will have to face as individuals or as churches. To pay attention to advice such as this can only strengthen us spiritually and unite us with our fellow believers.